My name was Lauren Miller, and I was 41 that evening. I stood in a Boston hotel room, slowly fastening a bracelet on my wrist and looking at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed composed, confident, even a little cold. But I knew how much lay beneath that calm. This evening wasn't just a formality, not just another professional event. It was the culmination of a journey no one in this room knew about, a journey I'd carried within myself for too long. The gala was being held in a historic building with high ceilings and huge windows overlooking the river. I was being recognized for my contributions to the development of bioengineering education programs and for research that had helped launch several national initiatives in recent years. I was accustomed to conferences, to formal speeches, to applause. But today, there was a strange tension within me, as if the past I'd kept locked away for years was about to resurface. When I entered the hall, I was greeted by the familiar noise, quiet conversations, the clinking of glasses, polite smiles. Colleagues approached, shook my hand, and congratulated me in advance. I nodded, responding with the usual phrases, trying not to show my racing heart. At some point, it became stuffy. I excused myself and headed toward the restroom, deciding to catch my breath before the official part began. The bathroom was almost empty. I went to the sink, turned on the cold water, and closed my eyes for a second. And it was then that I felt someone else in the room. I looked up and met the eyes of a woman reflected in the mirror behind me. My mother. She stood at the other sink, carefully applying lipstick, as if this were a casual encounter, not a confrontation after almost 16 years of complete silence. She was wearing an expensive dress, impeccable hair, and jewelry that screamed status. She hasn't changed much. Or perhaps I have. Our gazes met, and her hand froze. "Lauren," she said in a calm, detached voice, "I didn't expect to see you here." I clenched my fingers, resting them on the edge of the sink. "Likewise," I replied calmly. "I'm here for work." She nodded, as if she'd heard something insignificant. "Your father and I received an invitation. We've long supported educational foundations." "I'm being honored today," I said, looking her straight in the eye, "for the research and programs I've been creating over the past few years." For a moment, something akin to surprise flickered in her gaze, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "I see," she said, turning back to the mirror. "Well, everyone finds their place eventually." That phrase hit me hard, plucking from my memory the day I left home forever. I was 19. At school, I was considered bright but unstable. I struggled with anxiety and prolonged depression, which were not generally discussed in our family. When I once tried to explain to my mother that I was struggling, she looked at me with irritation and said I was just being lazy and making excuses. "You have everything," she kept repeating. "People dream of this kind of life." The pressure was constant. My grades started to drop. My motivation vanished. When I didn't get into a prestigious university and got into an ordinary state college in Ohio, my father was furious. That evening, he said I was a disgrace to the family name, that I hadn't lived up to the investment and expectations. The conversation ended briefly and harshly. Either I quit, or I stopped considering myself part of the family. I left, with one bag, a couple $100s, and a feeling of being erased. For the first few months, I lived with a friend, worked at a 24-hour pharmacy, and studied during the day. It was scary, it was lonely, but with it came a strange feeling of freedom. No one expected me to be perfect anymore. I chose bioengineering almost by accident because it was difficult and because I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. My first high score on an exam was a real shock. I cried in the car in the parking lot because for the first time in a long time, I felt proud. The years passed. I transferred, worked, slept for 4 hours, took internships that no one wanted. My parents didn't call. They didn't write. When I graduated with honors, they didn't even know. The only family member who came to my graduation was my Aunt Susan, my mother's sister, considered inconvenient in the family. She hugged me and told me I'd done the impossible. And those words were enough to keep me from breaking down. Gradually, my life came together. A master's degree, then a doctorate, my first publications, my own projects. I stayed in the US, moving first to Columbus, then to Boston. I began teaching, creating support programs for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, because I knew all too well how easy it is to become lost without support. And now I stood in the restroom at the gala and watched my mother calmly touch up her lipstick, as if all those years had meant nothing. She left first. I stayed another minute, looking in the mirror. My heart was pounding, but inside I felt strangely empty. I realized I no longer expected anything from her. When I returned to the hall, the lights had already been dimmed. The guests were taking their seats, and the MC had taken the stage. My name was called later, loud, clear, to applause. I stood up, feeling my knees tremble, and walked forward, knowing that this moment was mine, not theirs.
Not the past. Meaning.
And at that very moment, I didn't yet know that this evening would bring not only recognition, but also a confrontation impossible to prepare for. The applause lasted longer than I expected. It rolled in waves, filled the space, reflected off the walls of the hall, and at some point I couldn't distinguish faces. Everything merged into one blur, light, sound, movement. I smiled, nodded, accepted the congratulations, but inside I felt a strange detachment, as if I were watching from the outside. As if this wasn't my life, not my evening, but a well-choreographed scene where I knew the lines but didn't feel the part. After the formal part, people I'd known for years, and those I was seeing for the first time, approached me. They said the right things, admired the projects, and asked questions about future research. I responded automatically, catching myself returning again and again to the bathroom mirror and my mother's calm, almost indifferent voice. Everyone eventually finds their place. Those words stuck in my mind like a splinter. I noticed my father toward the end of the evening. He was standing at a far table, talking to one of the sponsors, his posture tense, his shoulders slightly raised, as if he were constantly bracing himself for a blow. Our gazes met only for a moment. He turned away first. I didn't approach him. I hadn't yet. When the event ended and the room began to empty, I stepped outside, breathing in the chill night air. Boston was buzzing with its usual life. Cars, the occasional passerby, the glow of streetlights. I stood on the steps of the building, feeling the fatigue wash over me all at once, without warning. Just then, a familiar, sharp voice rang out behind me. So, it's true. I turned around. My father stood a few steps away, without his usual confident smile, without the pretense of politeness. His face was hard, almost angry. Are you really the Lauren Miller this whole circus is all about? Yes, I replied. The same one. He grinned, but there was no humor in it. I never thought I'd see this. You. Here. On stage. And I never thought you'd even want to see me, I said calmly. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Do you even realize what this looks like? My company sponsors a foundation, and in the end, the money goes to you. It was an anonymous donation, I reminded him. And the decision wasn't yours or mine. It doesn't matter, he snapped. It still looks like you took advantage of the situation. I felt a familiar wave rise inside me, the same one that once made me cower and remain silent. But now everything was different. I didn't ask for anything, I said. And if you're so upset, consider this money non-existent for me. He looked at me for a long moment, searchingly, as if trying to find in me the 19-year-old girl he'd once kicked out of the house. You've always been stubborn, he finally said. Always went against what we tried to give you. You were trying to give me control, I replied. Not support. He turned away, waving his hand as if the conversation was over. Do what you want. But don't think that one evening changes everything. I didn't answer. Words suddenly seemed unnecessary. He left, disappearing into the darkness of the parking lot, and I remained standing, feeling something heavy slowly settle inside. I barely slept that night. Snatches of conversations, faces, memories swirled through my head. In the morning, I woke up with a clear, almost painfully distinct feeling. The money they were talking about would bring me no joy. It wasn't about recognition, but about a past I'd been trying to escape for so many years. I sat for a long time at the kitchen table in my apartment, looking out the window. The letter from the foundation officially confirming the grant was open on my laptop screen. The amount seemed unreal. She could support my projects for years to come, open new labs, and provide opportunities for hundreds of students. And yet, there was resistance inside. I remember myself in a small room with a fold-out couch, remembered the night shifts, the exams, the fear of failing. I remembered the students who came to me for consultations with the same expression, confused, tired, almost desperate. And then the solution became obvious. I contacted the foundation and arranged the transfer. The entire grant would go toward creating a scholarship program for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, for those the system had become accustomed to overlooking. No big names. No last names.
Just a chance.
When I pressed the confirm button, there was no triumph inside. There was calm.
Pure, calme, genuine.
That same evening, Aunt Susan called me. "I heard," she said, "and I knew you'd do just that." I smiled. "I don't need to prove my worth anymore." "You proved it long ago," she replied. I hung up and went to the window. The city was living its own life, and at that moment, for the first time in a long time, I felt like the past was truly behind me. Not because I'd run away from it, but because I'd stopped letting it control me. Several months had passed since the gala, but its echoes still returned to me from time to time, not as pain, but as a quiet reminder that some knots in life cannot be untied immediately. Sometimes you just have to leave them behind. Autumn in Boston was cold and clear. I dove into work again, headlong, almost greedily, as if trying to fill the space once occupied by doubt. The scholarship program I had supported with the grant was growing faster than I expected. Letters arrived every day from students, from professors, from college coordinators in different states. The stories varied, but I recognized something familiar in each one. Someone was living in a car because they couldn't afford housing. Someone was working nights, so they could study during the day. Someone wrote that they were the first in their family to ever attend university. I read these letters late at night, sitting on the couch with a cup of cold tea, and each time I caught myself thinking that I'd made the only choice possible for myself. At university, people started talking about me differently. Not loudly, not demonstratively, but with respect. Colleagues asked for advice, invited me to collaborate on projects. Students increasingly stayed after lectures, asking questions not only about the subject but also about life, about choices, about the fear of making mistakes. I never told them my entire story, but sometimes I allowed myself short phrases, hints from which they could understand the main thing. The path doesn't have to be straight to get where you want. I tried not to think about my parents. After that night, my father hadn't contacted me. Neither had my mother. And it was easier than I expected, as if space had finally been made inside for something else, for the present. But the past, as it turns out, doesn't always go away of its own accord. In early December, I received a letter. A real one, a paper one, with a return address I recognized instantly. My mother's handwriting was still as neat and precise as if she'd traced each letter with a ruler. I held the envelope in my hands for a long time, hesitating to open it. Inside, there was not so much curiosity as wariness. I knew that any word from her could stir up what I'd spent so long learning to keep under control. I opened the letter late that evening. She wrote that she'd been thinking a lot, that evening had made her see things differently, that perhaps she and my father had been too strict, that she'd like to talk. Not a word of apology. Not a word about what had been done wrong. Only cautious, almost diplomatic wording, as if they were discussing a business partnership and not years of estrangement. I put the letter aside and sat in silence for a long time. There was no anger or joy inside, only fatigue. I realized that conversation was possible, but not at any cost. Not on their terms. I wrote a reply the next day. Briefly.
Calmly.
I thanked them for the letter and wrote that I wasn't ready to meet right now, but perhaps someday, provided we had an honest conversation. I didn't know if they would understand. And, frankly, it stopped being important to me. Shortly before Christmas, I went to a small town in Pennsylvania where the first reunion of scholarship students was taking place. The hall was ordinary, without pretension, with simple chairs and cheap fairy lights. But the atmosphere there was lively, genuine. I looked at these kids, excited, a little confused, full of hope, and suddenly felt something warm, almost painful, welling up inside me. A girl approached me after a meeting. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said quietly. "If it weren't for this program, I would have dropped out." I nodded, at a loss for words. In that moment, I realized, this is it. This is what it was all about. Not the stage, not the applause, not the titles. But these moments when you see that your path, no matter how difficult, can become a source of strength for someone. That evening, I walked down an empty street, wrapped in my coat, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly whole. Without the need to prove anything. Without the desire to look back. I knew there would be more conversations ahead. Perhaps more than one. But now it no longer frightened me. Because I finally understood. I don't have to return to the place where I was once broken to prove that I am strong. I already knew that. Spring came unexpectedly early. In Boston, it always felt that way. The air grew damp. The first timid patches of green appeared on the sidewalks, and the city seemed to shed the weight of winter. I walked across the university campus and caught myself thinking that something similar was happening inside me. Something had finally shifted, no longer aching with every memory, no longer demanding an immediate answer. There was a lot of work to do. The scholarship program was expanding, new partners were joining it, other universities, even several private foundations. My name was increasingly being mentioned not only in the context of research, but also in systemic changes in education. Sometimes it was daunting, not because of the scale, but because of the responsibility. I knew that I now had real people behind me, their hopes, their future. And I had no right to take this lightly. One evening, when I was staying in my office longer than usual, Aunt Susan called again. "Your mother called me," she said without preamble. "She asked how you were." I closed my eyes. "And what did you say?" "The truth," she said softly. "That you're alive, well, and doing something meaningful." A pause fell between us. "She said she wanted to meet," Susan continued. "Not on her terms, just to talk." I was silent for a long time. The old resistance was gone, but the urge to rush out wasn't there either. "I'll think about it," I finally said. We agreed to meet in a month. Neutral territory, a small cafe in New York, no fuss, no witnesses. I knew my father probably wouldn't come, and that was just as well. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early and sat by the window. When my mother walked in, I immediately noticed how she had changed. Not in appearance. In appearance, she was still flawless. Her gait, her gaze, a subtle uncertainty had changed. She sat down across from me and for a moment simply looked at me, as if trying to get to know me anew. "You look calm," she said. "That's how I feel," I replied. The conversation was difficult. Not dramatic, not loud, just difficult. She spoke of fear, of how she was afraid I would ruin my life if I didn't live up to expectations. I listened and, for the first time, didn't try to justify or explain. I simply talked about myself, about what it's like to be rejected, about how loneliness can either destroy or strengthen, about how I'm not angry, but I'm not forgetful either. She didn't cry, but at some point, her voice wavered. "I didn't know how to be different," she said quietly. "And I didn't have to pay for it. I replied, just as quietly. We parted without hugs, without promises, but also without that icy wall that had stood between us for years. I left the cafe and realized that this was the maximum possible, and that was enough. That summer, I received a letter from one of the first scholarship recipients. She wrote that she had been accepted to the master's program, that she no longer feared the future. I reread the letter several times and smiled. In moments like these, I felt especially keenly. My story no longer belonged solely to me. Sometimes the past still reminded me of itself, in dreams, in random phrases, in old photographs. But it no longer defined me. I was no longer a girl standing with a bag by a closed door. I was a woman who chose which doors to open. That evening, I walked along the embankment, watching the sun slowly set over the horizon. It was quiet inside. Not empty, quiet. And in that silence, for the first time, I clearly understood I hadn't just survived. I had created a life with meaning, choice, and freedom. And that was more than enough.